All right, we are live. So welcome everybody to another FYI webinar from PALCUS. We are here with Dr. Belinha Debreu, and I'm super excited because this is a topic I think that everyone will understand. Maybe they don't understand media literacy, what that means, but I think everybody can understand questioning, do I believe what I see on Facebook? Do I believe what I see on the news? Do I, what sources are true and what, who do I trust? And, are you questioning everything? Because it's gotten really confusing. And I think even for our Portuguese community, we, what about the Portuguese media? And do we believe them because it's different than the US? And so there's all these questions. And I think it's a great topic, especially as the political polarization, if you will, of the last few years has really driven a wedge in our community. I mean, it's driven a wedge in society in general, and that's been mirrored in our community where we see, family members and people who used to be friends now arguing and defriending each other on Facebook. And so it's just a big mess. And so I'm really excited to have someone here to kind of walk us through this. And this is first of a 5-part series where we're going to dissect what this all means, and hopefully we can all feel a little bit better and figure out how to, identify what sources and how to believe, or how to know what to believe. So without further ado, Dr. Belinha Debreu, thank you so much for joining us. I'm so happy to have you here.
Thank you for having me. I'm really happy to actually talk about this topic. It's very personal to me in the work that I do, but also in the way in which I see the world right now. It's something that I do not just here in the United States, but all over the world. And my counterpart that I do it with in Portugal is Dr. Vitor Tomea. And unfortunately, he can't join us today because he actually happens to be in the Cape Verde Islands, and he's actually stuck on one of the islands and he cannot get to an internet site that would allow for a good connection. So I'm sorry that he won't be with us today, but you will get to meet him further along when we're doing these different types of workshops. And I certainly will appreciate his perspective because he is actually in Lisbon. He is doing work in Portugal, in the Azores, in the Cape Verde Islands. And so we'll actually get a really nice perspective from him. And he and I do work together with a lot of US Portuguese communities because of the work that I've done here in the United States, which is kind of built on things that I've seen happening in schools and academia, and then in communities, which, as you said, we are in a time where information and disinformation is everywhere, and it's incredibly problematic, and it's coming to us from multiple sources, and that is why we are sort of in this space. Traditionally, certainly when I grew up, and when you grew up, Angela, and many of the people who are joining us, we had 3 television stations in the United States. It was CBS, NBC, ABC, wherever you were in the United States, maybe even 2 in some places. But now we're getting information in news, or if we call it news, because that's also questionable, from hundreds of different places. And our youth are definitely not getting it in the traditional format that we used to see at 6 o'clock and so forth. And it's really broken down the fabric of our society in terms of how we validate information or invalidate it, and has created more of a division than there should be. And it actually saddens me when people tell me that they don't talk to family members now because they don't agree on information. And so I think my hope is, with the work of media literacy education, which I'll explain in more detail, we'll get to a point where we can agree to disagree and still have conversation and dialogue, because it's super important for our world, and frankly, for our governments to, move forward and work together. So
Amen.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So over the course of this time, and I've said this to Angela as well, if questions come in, feel free to interrupt me, stop me along the way. I probably have more in here than is necessarily for a 1-hour webinar, but everything that I have in here can continue into the different types of topics that we have discussed that we're going to take up. And so certainly the misinformation piece is huge. And so that's a big issue, and we definitely need to look at that. We also need to look at, why are we there? And I think we have to also address the digital divide in terms of technology and access and technology knowledge. I mean, who knows where to get information now when there is so much? How do we find what we need? And then certainly health information, because we've lived through and are continuing to live through COVID, now monkeypox, and most recently, I am sort of flabbergasted at the fact that polio is on the rise in this country. And I think that really has led to, the way in which people see information from our health officials. And that has been definitely spiraled by the way it came from COVID, and certainly a lot of the impact of having medicine mixed in politics, which has been problematic. And then also looking at digital well-being, which I think we really have to look at in terms of anxiety, stress, screen time. Parents are really worried about the amount of time that their kids have been on these computers and their phones and their iPads. And certainly, once again, bringing it back to COVID, it was the thing that saved us, but also the thing that kind of spiraled us back into, we're on 24/7, and people wake up with it and fall asleep to their technology, and there's no separation. And that's also led, I think, to the point where we have a lot of mis and disinformation and the acceptance of information without questioning it, which is why I think media literacy is really important. So with that, here's our, perfect slide about the division of information. And I, when I saw this, I thought, oh, this is perfect. It's everyone behind the mask and everyone thinking about different things. I believe in CNN. I don't believe in CNN. I believe in Fox. I don't believe in Fox. I believe it's this person's fault. It's that person's fault. And, it's funny to think about, and I apologize, you're going to hear a bell. But it's funny to think about, but the reality is that this idea of information problem is not unique to the United States. The cover of The Economist today has the Brazilian president on it and the issues that they're dealing with mis and disinformation. My European counterparts will tell you that mis and disinformation are everywhere. When we look at Brexit in England, or we look at some of the things that have happened in other countries, we are all now in this same space. And the concern is, how do you find truth when there is no transparency in the media? And that is really the goal of where we're going. So I think, to kind of give you an idea, I mean, this is something that has been done by the European Union Disinformation Lab, where information and disinformation can be found. And clearly, as you can see, it doesn't matter if you're in the United States or overseas, we're getting it. And the target, the fake media outlets, and I actually hate the term fake media, but really places and sources where disinformation is being propagated is being fed out through many, many sources. And it's not vetted well. At least in the European Union, they actually have some laws right now in place for that. But in the United States, we don't. And so I always find it fascinating when Afito over here would tell you about the work that he's done in the European Council, where they've actually, when working and having task force to deal with these issues. And here in the United States, we still use the internet very much like the Wild West, and that's incredibly problematic. And so, this kind of,
Sorry.
Yes,
Sorry,
go ahead.
Can you go back to that slide and say, so I see, the symbol for poison, alien heads, and is that a ghost in the blue? Can you explain what those are?
So basically, the idea of this is where how bad is it? It's like the leveling of bad, really.
Okay.
And, it's really bad. It's pretty bad, and it's kind of crazy. But this is really where, unfortunately, we're finding the problems just keep growing. And a lot of this has to do very much with the algorithm and the way in which we perceive information, where it goes, and then where the algorithm thinks that we want to go next. And I'm going to talk more about the algorithm in a later webinar, but this is certainly something that we need to think about, because there's been a lot of blame about, oh, who did what and where is it coming from? Is it, is it China? Is it Russia? Is it this? Is it that? And the reality is it's also within the US as well. And the fact is that when someone hits that share button, they're adding to the problem that we're seeing. If you don't check your sources and you don't check your information and you share it, and it's easy to share headlines that capture us, and it sounds almost too crazy, but it's got to be true, right? So
clickbait, right? This is
it's clickbait.
You call it?
Absolutely, 100%. It's definitely clickbait. So anyway, I'll have another one that actually kind of references this back too, but I wanted to just point out, like, this is literally a worldwide issue. In the Azores right now, there are people being trained, teachers, to look at media literacy, which is called literacia mediática in Portugal. And there are people working there very tirelessly to get teachers trained to think about information. It's happening in Portugal, Venezuela, there's a struggle to find truth. And we can pull from almost every single country. Nigeria, they have to worry about navigating, fake news there just for election purposes. France, the lessons about Twitter. What do you post? How do you post what you post, and knowing what the answers are there? Turkey, I mean, talk about, when war is happening, who's more vulnerable to mis and disinformation? Our Ukrainian population is having this issue right now. Who's getting correct information about why there is a war in Ukraine? And that's hugely problematic. Asia and Africa, the BBC has been trying to tackle this problem with news in Asia and Africa. And, there's a question about, okay, when, companies like BBC, are they doing it for the sole purpose of making sure that people follow their news sources, or are they looking at for other reasons? But I do think in general, if I look at all the news sources, and that includes even the ones that we think of negatively, everyone really does want this idea of truth to be out there. The question is the version of truth, right? India, misinformation during their election cycle, and the fact that this has been something that has been a problem for them for many years, actually. Even when it came to how COVID was covered. Myanmar, hard to believe, right? But yet we know that genocide happened in Myanmar because of mis and disinformation that was filtered through Facebook. So clearly the impact of information can lead to some devastating consequences, and we can't let that not be something that we talk about and think about. China, and the fact that people worry about things like, who's controlling some of these applications. And, for a very long time, I wouldn't get WhatsApp for quite some time because of the concerns related to that. And yet now I have it because my international counterparts use it. And so there are reasons why we choose to use the technologies that we use. And that is also a part of the question. The World Economic Forum has known this for a long time. And it's not just, about the vaccine, although people will talk about that, but it impacts finances when people believe certain things to be true or things not to be true. And we had an example of this last year with Bitcoin, where people were buying into Bitcoin and then it blew itself up and then blew itself out and really impacted a number of people who had bought stock into this area. So there's a lot of conversation about media literacy as the antidote for disinformation. And this map was given to me from one of my European counterparts, and I really think it kind of talks very much to, where they think media literacy is happening. And the reality is that media literacy is getting its traction finally. The reason why has everything to do with disinformation. And that's the first time, and probably I've been doing this now for 25 years. And when we used to talk about information and disinformation, we were talking it as part of the media lens. It wasn't just this conversation. But when people started talking about things like fake news and post-truth and alternative media and alternative truths, this pushed media literacy to the forefront. But it's not the only thing that media literacy represents. And I definitely want to make sure that we cover that. So the definition for media literacy education, this is probably the right time for that. It's a 21st century approach, provides a framework to access, analyze, evaluate, and create messages in a variety of forms. Why is that important to know? Well, accessing information is the first thing. There are places around the world where access is a problem. And so part of media literacy is understanding how to get information, where to get it, being able to actually get to a place to get information. And then the analysis and the evaluation piece, how do you comparatively look at information and think, this is a good source, that's a bad source. And also, because we are at this point in our world, we are creators of media. So not only is the media streaming information to us, we as a consumer now are streaming information back. And that may be, to our friends, to our colleagues, just because we love to create things. Our teens in particular and our youth are really big into the creation spaces with TikTok and Instagram and so forth, but so are our adults, because I see a lot of them doing reels and all of that as well. So being creators of media has also been an impact. And the reason why this is so important is because it helps to build our understanding of the role of media in society. And we have been living with media for a very long time, which is why I said in the beginning, when I did this, we were talking about things like in radio and television and films. It wasn't just about news, but yes, we analyzed news, but we also looked at what is it that we're seeing around us? How does advertising impact us? How do we purchase things or consider things? Where do we go to get tools or products, or how do we search for things on the internet? This is all a part of this education of information, because it is very much an essential skill for inquiry. And it's also part of our self-expression now as citizens of a democracy. How do we know to get the best information about a candidate? And this is probably, of all the things, being a citizen of a democracy means that we are also participating as individuals to find better sources or better pieces of information. It is not one way any longer, though, which is interesting to think about. When we used to talk about communications, it very much was that. You'd sit in front of a television, it would give you the information, you would be the receiver of it, and you never did anything with it. Once we started seeing the buildup of technology, that started to change. So let's look at a little bit of history with it, just because I think it's important of how we got from one step to the next. Most of us, when we were growing up, many of us had newspapers. It's not that newspapers don't exist, but the traditional mode of newspapers has shifted and changed. We aren't getting that newspaper delivered to us. People aren't reading into newspapers the way they used to. And that's, I think, part of the problem that we're seeing as well with how people are getting information, because newspapers and magazines take time to write the articles that they write, and they provide a more in-depth look. We very much have switched to these very fast-paced, quick pieces of information as we're going through. As time has moved on, the thing that really probably shifted for us was the social media aspect. And really important to think about is this idea of where Twitter took us, because originally Twitter put us out into the space where people felt like they could communicate about what was happening in the world. And it very much was used as that way in the beginning, as a tool for good. People in war zones were using Twitter to tweet out information about where things were happening and so forth. But then over time, it started to switch. And now Twitter has become the place that kind of highlights the worst of society in many ways, and a fragment of actually what's happening. It still serves as a purpose for good, but I think you have to really look to it to find where it is that you want to create those spaces in there, because it's become a bit jumbled in many ways. But just actually, I'm going to go back to this really quickly. So, up until 2009, Twitter wasn't being used the way it's being used. Twitter really had its first opportunity in the realm of news when we had the plane land in the Hudson. Some of you might remember that from years ago. People on the docks were tweeting about it, but news agencies weren't there to film it. So the first images we started to get were from people from cell phones, people who were actually in vehicles watching the plane come in. That's where the shift came in. All of a sudden, Twitter made an impact, and we were really seeing it change the way in which it evolved into the way we carry information. We're connected to our technologies. There's this interesting idea of, where do humans and technology separate? And really, when you look at youth today, you see them connected 24/7, the earbuds in, they're tuning out everybody. I used to show this image and people would say, oh my God, I never want to be this person that's connected to technology in this way. And yet we do know there are communities that are using technology very much like that. Are we willing to be connected to the point where we're willing to have a barcode embedded into our skin? It sounds very like science fiction like, but we know this is actually something that is being considered in different communities. So it's not an impossibility. This is very Borg-like for any of you guys who are Star Trekky people out there. It's a pop culture piece, but a reference, but this very much reminds me of that. When do we stop looking at humanity because we've connected so much to the technology? And the worry really is that it's changing us as generations go on. We're not just, we don't look at things the same way, and our generations are being separated in many ways because of the different types of technology. We worry about this idea of millennials and the me, we're always on it. The selfies, the way in which, this has become, you go to a show or you go to an event and you're watching it behind your cell phone versus actually being present to enjoy the moment. I've seen it now in funerals, which I'm always kind of horrified about, to be honest with you. I'm like, what is going on here? There are moments in time when we we need to remember that our humanness is about the connections we have with other humanists, and the technology gets in the way. I was recently at a wedding and I heard this young lady behind me. She was watching. It was actually interesting. It was a young girl who was saying to her father, why do you have your camera out? You're supposed to be here at the wedding. Watch the wedding, not through the camera. And I thought, wow.
Wow, the girl was telling her father that. Usually it'd
Yeah,
be the other way around, right?
it's
That's
so
funny.
true. But I think that's changed the way in which we see our humanity shifting, and the people who are involved in this really evolving with it. And our youth is starting to feel this disconnect because even their parents are online 24/7 now, especially our children, when they're trying to get their parents' attention and their parents are scrolling instead of watching them. So it's really starting to shift a bit. But it is important to know it's not shifting fast enough. And because of that, we have this problem where people are stuck in not being happy, and they're trying to find this digital technology so that it will actually be, these happy moments will come. And that's part of the problem, is that we're using technology as a substitute for these human connections. And because of that, it's led us to a problem where we're in the stream of just information and we just don't know what's real. And the question has come up, is truth dead? Do we even know what truth means? And with that, trustworthiness. So that's a huge part of the issue. And did it stem from social media, or did it stem from other things, or the combination of all of it happening simultaneously and not without having some pattern in place? So that's something that, go ahead.
Yeah. So, I mean, for me, I just having observed, like, if I look back at the last 10, 15 years, it was certainly a gradual thing. Right. And I feel like it's definitely hit a sort of not a climax, but like it's coming to a head now. But now you even have sites that were supposed to debunk myths, like Snopes. Even those you're starting to question, right? Because are they politically motivated? I mean, it's just, you literally are at a point where you're like, I don't know that anything anybody ever tells me or anything that I ever read is ever true.
And that's a problem, because so innately as human beings, we want truth. And I had this conversation with my college students recently, because I asked them, I said, does truth matter to you? And, they all said yes. And I said, in which ways? How does it matter to you? Does it matter in a relationship? Do you want your significant other to be truthful to you? Yes. Does it matter when you're playing sports? Is truth important to you? Like, and that innate feeling of I want truth is there. It's just that it's gotten kind of convoluted with all the other pieces, and so much information is coming at a person that truth gets disintegrated. It's probably not the best word, but it really starts to feel less important when it's really the most important piece. So, and that unfortunately is partly why we've gotten to the space where we have filter bubbles in this country, and the pockets of, where information is. And I will say this from the US perspective too, because this is something that definitely divides us from our European counterparts, our families in Portugal and so forth. We're such a big country, and yet the way people perceive the US is very fractionalized by our media. So, and I'm sure most everyone's probably had this experience where, you go overseas and someone will say, oh, you must be very rich, or you must be very affluent. And I always ask, why do you think that? And depending on the year that I go, it has everything to do with the television show that they're watching. So someone will say to me like, oh, well, the Kardashians. And I'm like, wow, the Kardashians are a sphere onto their own, right? But I can go back to as far back as the 80s and being in Portugal, and people were watching Dallas. And that's a very, for those of you who don't know what Dallas is, Dallas
was it. Yeah, Crystal Carrington, man.
Yes.
No, that was Dynasty.
Dynasty.
Okay, anyway,
no, that's right. But Dallas had the same kind of thing. Dynasty,
Yes.
Dallas were sort of all a part of that same genre. Very affluent families. Fort Worth, Everyone had these big cars and horses and these houses, which is funny to think about because those houses in the 80s are actually tiny in comparison to the houses that we see in today's media. But at that time, it was massive. And so people thought we lived like people in Dallas, and that's not true, right? And I also think there's also this misunderstanding and misconception of what it is to have a house in the United States and the cost. I mean, just the element of what money looks like from country to country looks very different. But even within the United States, okay, if we look at these filter bubbles, this is actually an example of where the media happens to be. That's why it's called the fourth estate in this particular slide. And what resonates with me with this, and I use this often, is that if the country that is so large believes where the media happens to exist, which happens to be very East Coast and West Coast, we're missing a huge part of the country, which is also why we don't have accurate information. We don't have big media in the middle of the country. And the media that is in each of these areas tends to fit a certain frame of reference for the people who live in those communities. And that's problematic as well, because those are not the same types of communities that are in the rest of the country. And it's an important piece to note, because sometimes people are shocked at how elections go. But if you understood that our country is not based on where you are at that moment in the community, it would probably not be quite as shocking. And that is also why certain things that, people will say, well, I'd like to abolish this or never have this. And I'm like, well, except that if you live maybe in Wyoming, you might not actually think that. But if you live in Boston, Massachusetts, you would. So you have to know where you are and why it is that you have certain things happening. And the issue for me is that the media itself is not doing the job that it needs to do to get information to us about these different parts of the country. So assumptions are being made about people, assumptions are being made about different things, and that's another part of the problem. That also has led us to why we're also in this craziness with science and what we believe and what we don't believe and so on and so forth. And that's something that I think we'll definitely delve into further. I don't want to touch too much upon it, but I do want us to know that we are at a time when we're using it as a weapon against people. And that's added to the mis and disinformation and also to the believability of information. And my worry is, especially with seeing the polio rates are increasing, that we're going to actually hurt our society if we don't really see the differences, or we can separate out the good information from the bad and not weaponize it in this way, because health is fundamental to what we need for our society. Which also led us to our conspiracy theories, right? I mean, I can't tell you how many people have recited a conspiracy theory to me, and I always find this fascinating because it's also one of these conversations I love to have with people, because sometimes conspiracy theories are based in somewhat truth. And I have a colleague of mine who we have this sort of going back and forth about. It's the kernel of truth in it that got blown into different ways, and depending on what people perceive and how people feel about a particular topic, it can go in sometimes some very dark places, and also where, once again, misinformation lives. And I can tell you, I'm in Connecticut, and we have had probably the worst example of this happen with the Sandy Hook, the students who were killed in Sandy Hook and Alex Jones. And that's finally coming to fruition now, where the amount of mis and disinformation, the fact that, people would show up at the gravesite of the children and accost the parents, that's the level of where mis and disinformation can go very bad. And so it's something to be aware of for sure. Part of knowing where we're at is understanding that these social networks have kind of grown and led us to where we are to a certain degree. Facebook may not be our teens' place to go, but it's definitely where our middle and older generation is going. YouTube is still the top choice among teens and youth. That's their place. Twitter, so-so. Instagram is definitely a place where they go. Snapchat, 100%. LinkedIn, not so much. It's a business zone for the most part. Although, interestingly enough, it is now very much becoming also a social space. And that kind of leads us to this. It kind of gives you an idea of, by age group, where it is that people are to get information. So the interesting thing about this is that this also tells you where you need to go to give good information as well. You know, people use this as a negative, and I also see it as a positive. Like, we have to think about, if our youth is on YouTube, then maybe that's where we need to provide good quality information. If our youth are on Instagram, how do we actually get to there? And TikTok's not even on this list, and we know TikTok has actually been at the forefront of it. I'm still not topping YouTube, but very much there, because that's where the next space is that they're going to, that they are in. So it's important to think about that, especially because we know that the viewership for our big media corporations are all declining, because that's not where our youth are going. What's at stake? And I think it's really important to really think about that. When we don't have good information, we are left with this breakdown in the fabric of our society. Who's left? Who's right? You know, what are we talking about? You don't know what you're talking about. I know better than you, all of that. And I always say to people, it's important to look at all of it. There's two companies that are been putting these charts out. One is called AdFonts and another one's called All Sides. And they break it down, and they definitely write out the partisanship and where it skews and the whole thing. I think it's important to look at all sides. One of the things that I do as a media literacy educator is I listen to all of it, which always, and I say listen, I have to tell you, I don't watch all of it, I listen, and it's purposeful. I noticed over the course of after 2015, 16, 17, the rhetoric was getting lost in the things that I was seeing happening even on the television screen. And so I'm a listener. I listen to all the different stations, CNN, Fox, MSNBC, BBC America, Canada Talks, Korea News, you name it, RTP, or in some cases, there's actually a Portuguese broadcast that comes out of Rhode Island. And all of it. So I listen to it because in listening, I can filter all of that out, all the things that are sort of enhancing the screen that I don't need to know. I need to listen to the content. And I think that's really important, is that we need people to listen more to the information, and that would help people to understand where information is and the perspective of information. Both of these companies are always updating, changing things. I know some people who have looked at it said, oh, I don't know that I believe that they're that far left or that far right, but they spend a lot of time figuring out, you know, where the news is and seeing where it goes. It's an option to look at. It's important to know maybe where you're getting your information and recognize that perhaps I'm only getting one side of the story, and maybe you need to see something that's on the other side. Maybe not for everything, and I'm not saying that. I don't know that I necessarily need you to believe every single thing on the other side, but I think people should be aware that there's multiple perspectives on a piece of information, and that's why people believe the information that they believe. What's at stake is, if we don't ever get to that point, we're going to get to a point where we aren't able to read our media. We won't be able to actually have media, because everything will be really, it won't exist. This was done in 2019 or 2020, where newspapers around the world basically blacked out everything on their front page. And they did that to show that the importance of media cannot be dismissed. We were at that point where people were saying, oh, it's all bad, it's all junk. The reality is, there's a reason why we've needed the media in our lives this whole entire time. In the US, it's part of our Constitution, and the reason why is so that it holds people accountable to what it is that they're doing. And this is something that is true in various parts of the world as well. There are places in the world that do not have free press. And it's really important to remember that. When you don't have free press, you don't get to speak, and you don't have a voice within the system. And despite all the problems that we have with our own media, we still have that. And I think it's important to acknowledge that if we lose all of that, you know, we lose this opportunity to have communication and community, and also to get information, which I think is very important and valuable for all of us. Angela, if I'm going too close over time, you're gonna have to, you know, give me a
yeah, no, we're good. We have about 15 minutes.
Okay, great. So One of the things that has happened in the course of the last couple of years is that there's this thing called the Trust Project. And what has happened is that a lot of newspapers and just different companies have said, you know what, I want us to be out there as being on the forefront of giving good information. I want people to allow for to this. We believe that this is what is going on, that we have good media. And so this trust project was brought about, and it's this idea of transparency in the news. And these different corporations are saying that this is what we're doing. We're trying our best to provide you with the best information, the best news. And so we believe in that. And so there's certain trust indicators they're supposed to follow and so forth to become a part of this trust project. I think, you know, even with this, there are still problems, especially because some of this is check systems. And the reality is when news is happening, sometimes transparency isn't happening simultaneously, or transparency may be over happening. There is that too, where sometimes too much information is being put out there without actually being filtered to say, oh, you know what, this is probably not what people need to see right now. And there are moments in time when we know that has to happen. So for those of us who remember 9/11, when literally people were just showing everything that was happening, including, you know, the bodies coming off of the buildings and so forth. That may have been the extreme of that, but it was all happening and there was no filtering system to stop that either. But it was such a monumental event that was happening that I think people were just capturing it and everything was going out on the air. When there are moments, we had this moment this past year where there was a bombing in Ukraine, and the bombing killed a whole family, and the front page of the New York Times carried the dead bodies of the mother and the children. And there were these questions about, is that too much? Is that too much truth for people? And, you know, and there's this argument about that. You know, are we protecting people too much from the realities of what's happening in the world? I think that's a real conversation to be had, because, you know, with everything that we're talking about, if you don't see it, you don't sometimes believe it. And yet at the same time, sometimes seeing too much is literally just that, too much. And I think we have to be reasonable about that. There are protocols in place for things like, for example, after, you know, if you watch the 6 o'clock news, how much footage of really, you know, awful detrimental things can be shown. What's the difference between that at 6 and 10 o'clock? It has to do with who's sitting in front of a TV at that moment. Are children watching? Is it the family? At 10 o'clock, they tend to see adults and so forth. And so different, more images can go on at 10 than that could go on at 6 o'clock. But that's a media literacy lesson right there. Some people don't even know that. And I think that's important to know. There are different things that are happening during the day with the media so that it filters information to the different groups that are out there, including the advertising that goes on all day long on our stations. Who's home at 6 o'clock? Who's home at 3 o'clock? What ads are being shown at different times? That's a media literacy lesson in of itself. So our choices in this is that, you know, if we are not media literate, we tend to make very simple, but maybe probably some pretty wrong choices. And the reality is, to be media literate, you have to want to get better information. And so that makes it complex. And so one of the things that I know is certainly something that we talk about is in our world is certainly getting students to think about, media choices and media information, and to really be reflective. And for me, I think this should be something that's happening as soon as you know you're going to have a child, which some people laugh when I say this, but the reality is that this generation forevermore will have technology in front of them. And I think we need to show and teach people what that means. If you are always on your screens, I watch children being put in front of screens all the time. The iPad comes out at the dinner table. People don't talk to each other anymore. There are games in colleges where, everybody puts their cell phone in the center of the table, and first person to reach for it pays for the bill, and that's because conversation is important, and people have gotten to the point where they just want to scroll and scroll and scroll. There are things that have come along with the technology that has sort of broken down this, I think, contract with society, with ourselves, that we engage with people. And that's really really scary and problematic. And certainly, there's a leveling of what that should look like when it comes to business and what it looks like in different spaces. But, when you have a meeting with your doctor, you want to make sure he's looking at you and not looking at a cell phone, especially if he's telling you bad news. You want to feel like someone is there and is part of the actual stream of conversation. And I think that's where there has to be more dialogue about the complexity of some of these technologies and what it'll mean moving forward. It's a little bit about balance. And the other part is, it's also about who controls who. Is the technology controlling you, or are you controlling the technology? I love this picture because I think it really says it all in many ways, because I think it encapsulates what's happening now. It doesn't matter if it's in 2019. Right now, the cell phone in particular, is controlling all of us.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the only technology that's controlling us, but it is one of the big ones. And it used to be that it was on the other side. But the more bells and whistles that are out there, the more we believe this thing where, this is our life. We wake up to it. We fall asleep to it. We watch television on it. We watch movies on it. We are on dating apps or other apps that we think are a part of our lives. We have conversations or lack of conversations with people. We only text. I mean, there is a level of stuff that happens. One of the first things that I always tell people, if you really want to know how much you're consuming, look at your life for a week. Every day, mark down from the minute you get up in the morning, what media are you using? How much of it is in your life? And I'm not talking just about the cell phone, because the cell phone will tell you always your screen time. I'm talking about everything around you. How many screens do you walk by on a daily basis? When you're outside, how many ads are in front of you? Where is it that you're seeing media filtered to you? Are you sitting on a bus and you're getting ads? Are you on the road and you're seeing advertisements? Are you in a subway and seeing it? Are you in a bathroom, which actually has happened everywhere, that I can't amazed at the number of places where you can get ads.
Gas stations.
Gas stations everywhere. Where can you actually exist today and not
see an ad?
To not see an ad or be a part of a media piece, and
in
I
the
think
forest.
Yeah, you would hope, right?
Mm-hmm.
So those are some of the things that I think we really need to consider, because otherwise, when we talk about what we started with at the beginning, which is that people are not communicating with each other, one of the reasons why is because this has gotten in the way. And it should be a part of our lives 100%. And I certainly don't believe it should not be. It has proved to be very valuable in emergency situations. It's proved to be very valuable when we were in COVID, especially when we were in the lockdown. It was our source for communicating with family. And all of that is so very much true. It's made life easier in many ways, but it's also done the opposite. It's made people fearsome. It's made fear other people, I should say, not fearsome. It's also made people reliant on a tool as if they are not capable. And I say that because most people rely on these phones for directions. So they can't get anywhere without this thing telling them go left, go right, right? They don't know streets. They don't know maps. They don't understand their own community. And certainly with parents, there's a lot of arguments in schools going on about cell phone usage. Does a kid need a cell phone all the day? And the reaction always is, oh, yes, for emergency. And yet, in my lifetime going through school, we had a phone at the front desk, and now every classroom has a phone anyway. So it's interesting to think about. And certainly as a woman, if I'm driving someplace, I do feel like I've become reliant on a cell phone, where before I never did. We didn't have it. So
you almost feel safer, right? That you have it.
Right, exactly. But there has to be a balance. And I think that's where the goal is where do we go with this, and where's the balance within it? So with that, there is so much more to talk about. I could keep going on and on and on, but I won't. But I wanted to open it up to questions and anything else that you would like to ask.
Yeah, no, we have about 10 minutes for questions, but I would love to get your perspective on, because one thing that I don't think was addressed specifically here was like podcasts and a lot of the new essentially newsletters that journalists have been starting on their own because they felt they couldn't say what they wanted to say freely at the publication they were writing, whether it was New York Times, Wall Street Journal, other like major publications, right? Where now you have what they're calling independent media.
Right.
And, whether it's a podcast channel or a YouTube news show. And, it's funny because I actually watch more of those now personally than I do regularly news on the TV. And when I'm having a conversation with people, if we're talking about politics, I'll say, yeah, well, I was watching this YouTube news show or this podcast. And when you say it, it sounds so unauthoritative, right? Like, oh, you watched a YouTube show? Like, really? But honestly, like, it's a very, I'm not watching, a Roblox news show or anything like that. I mean, I'm very deliberate about the shows that I watch. So how are those news sources impacting things?
So it's a great question, because podcasts, I think, have taken off in a whole different way for exactly the reasons that you're saying, but also because I think some people felt that they were not given the time needed to cover some of the stories that really needed to be covered in depth. And then other people have been pushed out of mass media and are now creating podcasts. Certainly, probably one of the most famous ones right now would be Chris Cuomo, who has created a podcast. And he will be on one of these alternative, I think, media sites that will be coming up. And I believe you can only get it through Hulu or YouTube, which is interesting to think about. So you're right. So there's all of that happening. And the reality is that I think there's some benefit to, I think there's some benefit to all of it in different ways. I think that when someone really wants to do good news and they have a platform to do it and the people to follow them, that's actually a really good thing. And the other part is that it's not being paid necessarily by people, although as the hits go up there, then media companies are now going in and saying, hey, will you advertise for me in your show? So I hear it in the middle of a show now where someone will say, oh, I use, Gold Abound or whatever it may be. And then they start talking about it, but it's not filtered by someone at the outside. Now, the problem is the gatekeeping, right? Who decides what news is important or not important that day? What stories are getting carried? And by the same token, this is also about someone's perspective. It's about representation. So maybe the issue really is that it's not being represented by the group that is in the news. And so someone feels like that needs a better representation of it. And that's why the story needs to carry in a certain way. I see sometimes things like stories that are kind of under the radar of our mass media getting covered better in a podcast and on YouTube. And a lot of it, I think, has to do with, once again, this perception of mass media about what it is that they think is important. And I think that's been a part of the problem. I don't really believe, when I watch the news, I could listen to all the stations and tell you pretty much what the top story is going to be almost every day. And we've been circling around the same 3 stories for months now. One would be, especially in the United States. Right now, obviously, it's the death of the Queen. That's been a big thing. But it pushed out the stories of Ukraine, which even that wasn't getting. I just heard this thing that it got 15 minutes of airtime last week in the Ukraine.
In the whole week?
The whole week, because it got pushed out by the Queen, the death of the Queen, which took over everything. And I thought, and last week was when they just took back more land. That's just crazy for me to think about, but that was a statistic that was read. I certainly need to verify that, but it was actually given from another news media person who said, you know what, I was at fault too, because all we did was talk about the passing of the Queen and the monarch. But before that, and even now, it was, January 6 hearings, it was, Margot Law and all of this other stuff that's been happening, the same stories over and over again. And it's going on for 23 hours of our 24 hours news cycle. Half of the other hour is advertising and maybe 15 minutes of other news. So it's fascinating to think about. Also, and I'll just say this, news and opinion are 2 very different things.
Different things, yeah.
And what we hear a lot now is opinion and not news. And I think that needs to be something that we consider, especially when we're looking at information.
No, you're so right, because I often wonder, for some of these sites, some of these shows, the reporting on the news, like, what is their source
Right.
of
Right.
facts? Are they looking at other news reporting?
Sure.
Is there a report that came directly from the entity or the individual that the news is about? Where are they getting their information, and how do we know that their source is accurate, right?
Right.
And so then, to your point, is it news? Like, is it true, or is it now their opinion based on what they were able to find out?
Right.
And I wonder, to the topic that's on the question that's on the cover here, is truth dead? It's like, are we ever able to really find out what the truth is? Because frankly, so I'm in public relations, and even the source of news sometimes will spin things
Oh,
to how they
100%.
want people to
Sure.
view it, right?
Right.
So
Right. So I
it's
always,
so
that's why,
frustrating.
no, but I agree with you 100%. And I think that's actually one of the reasons why I have to listen to it all in many ways, because there's this fine line of truth that goes through. Like, if the same story is covered, the same story, and then it's the spin-off of that story, there's this fine line of what it is. We're not getting news the way in which we got information when Walter Cronkite was,
Right.
where this is the facts and that's the facts of the day. That's not the news that we're getting. And some people will say, well, facts can be really, messy too. And I'm like, but if the story is there and your job is to sit and report what it is, I shouldn't hear the words that sort of fluff the story, or the intonation behind that I don't like what they just said, which is, you can perceive already how people feel about a story by the way in which it's communicated. And that's why I always say, you really do need to listen. And just to add to that, I didn't cover a lot of the key questions for media literacy, because some of what you're saying is that, like, who constructed this message? Why is it being delivered? Who's paying for the message, frankly? Because, sometimes that's actually what's happening, is we're getting a PSA in many regards because some company paid for an advertisement, and that's not supposed to be news, and yet it does become part of the news.
Mhm.
So I think, and who's omitted from messages? Who don't we see in the media? Representation is a big conversation right now. And I think it's important to note that, because we don't see certain faces or certain people, and this is within our own community. Sometimes our own community doesn't feel represented by the media itself. The Portuguese community
Mhm.
doesn't feel represented in the media.
Absolutely.
We tend to feel like we're being spoken of versus actually having someone who speaks from the community. And that's a really important part of this. We really need to have a little bit better understanding of people, cultural understanding. We've kind of trying to throw this thing out there as if we're all quite the same, and yet we know that's not true. We've all come with our own, backgrounds, beliefs, socioeconomic, religious, ethnic, you name it. There's all of that in there, and
Mhm.
we don't parcel that out well in the media.
I would agree, and I'm going to give a plug for PALCUS, because that's one of the big reasons we started our podcast channel, and now we put so much on YouTube as well, because you know as a personal fan of podcasts, I realized there's really no podcasts out there talking about our community and
Yeah.
what issues are important to us, or even culturally about us. There have been a few more,
Right.
but I would say that PALCUS, we have 5 different shows on our podcast channel that address different aspects of the community. And an episode like this, even though it's a webinar, the audio will be published on the podcast as well. So plug for PALCUS: if you haven't subscribed to our podcast channel, subscribe.
Definitely. Absolutely.
And then secondly, I would just say, because we need to wrap up here, unfortunately. Everybody stay pay attention, because we have a few more series talking about these things coming up, and we will dive into a lot of different issues when it comes to media literacy and understanding the media and identifying truth. But I would say, listen to a wide range of sources, as painful as it may be
Yes.
to listen to Fox. If you're, and I would say, actually, don't listen to Fox. Find an independent media source, that's a podcast or maybe a YouTube channel, and try listening to them. Again, it might be painful, but it would, at least you're exposing yourself to the other side, and vice versa. If you're a conservative, go and listen to Kyle Kalinske or somebody, or like or Jimmy Dore, right? Is the complete opposite side of the aisle, but at least you're exposing yourself and getting yourself out of the bubble,
Right.
right? So
Right.
it helps you form a more well-rounded perspective, I
Sure.
think.
Yeah, and I think, look, at the end of the day, I don't mind that people listen to what they listen to. It does not matter to me, because ultimately the idea is for us to at least understand what the message is that people are receiving, so that we can have that dialogue. We are not on the same page on everything.
Yeah,
And I think that's something that people need to realize, like, we all, because of the fact that we come from different backgrounds, and we have had different experiences and different life experiences, we're not always going to agree.
right.
And that's an important part, but that doesn't mean that we can't have discourse. And it doesn't mean
Absolutely.
that we can't dialogue with each other. I think respectful dialogue and discourse is incredibly important. And it's the one thing that we're missing these days, which is vital for the continuation of our democracy.
100%. And with that, I'm going to wrap it up.
Yes.
My dogs
Okay.
are going to start barking here in a second because someone just came to the door. But thank you so much, Dr. Zabdu. Looking forward to our series. Thank you all for joining, and those who watched. Please submit your questions if you have questions afterwards. And with that, we'll say until later. Até a próxima.
Okay, adeus.
Adeus.
Obrigada.
Thank you.